Howdy, folks, and welcome to the live stream. This time I actually remembered to turn on the mic, and of course, that's my dog who has been dying to do a guest appearance in the whole thing, and he decided he's going to get in on the action just as an audio cue this time out. Maybe he'll appear in person next time out. Guys, thanks everyone for coming. What I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is post your comments in the chat, anything you'd like me to get around to as far as questions you'd like answered and so forth. Got kind of a weirdly preppy show. I hope it works out for you today. This is one where there's some big news in the making with DC and such, and we're trying to make sense of it. I wound up doing a lot of review of industry figures and so forth. Maybe I can give a perspective on this that's maybe a little bit different than what you read in Bleeding Cool News. Maybe not, but also interested in your thoughts on the situation as well. But before we get on to the DC thing, which is sort of the marquee event of the whole thing, let's talk a little bit about what's new with Comic Base. So this week, very slow program news. We put out a little minor bug tweak fix build. I think it's 3779. It fixes exactly one bug, which is if you were doing searches for date modified on a US system, and it basically, there's a bug we found in SQLite itself, where if you have data in your date fields that is of multiple types. So if it's for instance, you might write a date in America. If I want to say, today's date would be 8/12, 2020, right? If I wanted to write that in an international format, I might say 2020-08-12. Well, both of them are fine, and SQLite, our database engine, claims to handle both of them just fine. It turns out they lie. Basically, what they will do, if you're looking for date modified, we haven't been able to verify if this happens with anything other than the date modified field. But if you had some data that was, and you're saying, show me everything I modified after 3 p.m. today, it would return everything you modified after 3 p.m. today, as well as whatever old style data you happen to have in your database from previous versions of Comic Base where we used to not use the international format. So this is incredibly obscure. You may never do this search. If you feel like this is a search you might do and you want to make sure it gets fixed, go to your download the new build, build 3779 under. You can go get that under My Account Registrations and just use the download link, and then go to File, go to File Tools, and say Rebuild Lists, and check off Item Information. Depending on your machine, it might take 10 minutes, might take a little longer, and then it will basically scrub through all your dates and make sure they're all put in international format, so that no matter where you are in the world, if you're in Australia, if you're in France, if you're in Canada, if you're in Poughkeepsie, New York, the date modified search should work properly at that point. So not huge and groundbreaking. I just thought we'd get that out of the way because darn it, I killed like a day getting that bug resolved, and it was a weird one, so I just thought I'd share. Alright, so who we got here today? We got Greg, John, Andre, and so forth. Let's make sure that our chat stuff is working here. Indeed it is. Sweet. And it says I'm echoing. I wonder why that would be. Alright. I got nothing. Is that any better? John, if you could hit in the chat as to whether the sound is still glitchy for you. I can't think of a good reason why it would be echoing, but if it is, I'd like to know, because I can still twiddle with things on the dial right now and make different things happen. So yeah, let me know in the chat. And then Andre says hello. Okay, so let's get on with the main event. So the big news this week is DC basically, fired about a third of its editorial staff, including the one of the two co-publishers, Bob Harras. They have a very unusual corporate structure in that they had co-publishers. Okay, all right, good. No echoes. I'm hearing, so excellent. That's one less thing to freaking worry about. Anyway, backing it up to DC, because, after spending a morning doing nothing but reviewing corporate org charts and things like that, trying to get a sense for what's going on, this thing gets, I'm going to make this as clear as I possibly can given the vast and labyrinthine structure of the companies involved on this one. Basically, DC, as recently as a few years ago, had three co-publishers. Very, very unusual for a company to have multiple publishers. But they had Jeff Johns, Bob Harris, and Jim Lee, who all had the creative role of being in charge of overall publishing. So presumably they all got together in a big meeting, decided what books were going to get greenlighted, which storylines were going to get pursued, what directions, different properties were going to go, and so forth. And Jeff Johns left after a while. It just every time I say left, assume that the rumor was forced out, because that's the way things go in the corporate world. Went on and eventually founded his own production studio. Later on, and then as part of today, not today's, but Monday's Bloodshed, Bob Harris, very, very long time guy. He was a big dude over at Marvel back in the '90s, and now he is a big dude over at DC. Well, was until Monday. Basically, it sounds like got marched off the premises. Surprised him that he was being let go. And the only remaining person is Jim Lee now in terms of publishing. Jim, interestingly, has also been told that he's going to be transitioned out of his current role, and they'll be bringing up two new people underneath him. And then he'll be moving on to other things. He'll still maintain the title of creative. Let me get the actual title right because I had to look this up. Chief Creative Officer. But it's unclear what his actual work responsibilities will be once the whole thing is finally transitioned. So to start, let's just hit the full list of the known big names that got clobbered. So, of course, Editor-in-Chief Bob Harris, the SVP of Publishing and Strategy and Support Services, Hank Canals. Gosh, I'm hoping I'm saying everyone's names right. The VP of Marketing and Creative Services, Jonah Weiland. The VP of Global Publishing Initiatives and Digital Strategy, Bobby Chase. Now, any of you guys remember Marvel from the 80s and 90s? Bobby's name was everywhere. She started out as a lowly editor. If you guys remember Editor Week from Marvel from back in the day, she was one of the people that got featured on that. She eventually, I think just in the last few, certainly the last decade, moved over to DC, where she was put in charge of the Bat titles, I believe. Anyway, unfortunately, it sounds like she was shown the door. The senior story editor, Brian Cunningham, got let go. Executive editor, Mark Doyle, who also you might know as the head of Black Label. What is Black Label? If you guys don't know, that is these days largely magazine-sized mature readers' books. They kind of weave in and out of continuity, but basically it's what happened to Vertigo Comics got folded into Black Label. So Vertigo is no more. Black Label is what they're doing, and the guy that just used to run Vertigo, or the successor to Vertigo, just got shown the door. And then the VP of Comic Book Specialty and Newsstand Sales, Jim Sokolowski. By the way, one thing is just a guy who types names into databases all day long, or at least certainly that used to be a big part of my life. I'm amazed how many of these names the comic press would routinely just drop whole sections of their name. I believe, I want to say Variety, referred to him as Jim Sokolsky or something. Bob Harris, was Harris in half the press coverage you saw. It's funny because only the really good comic publishers, comic publishing guys, seem like they even got the names right. But like Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, just absolutely, they always say it's like, I don't care what you say about me, just spell my name correctly. Apparently, Variety and Hollywood Reporter could not manage that trick. But anyway, the VP of Comic Book Specialty and Newsstand Sales, Jim Sokolowski, got let go. And therein lies a note of concern. Because what is the whole overall theme of all this stuff, you might be asking? And I think it's fair to say, well, let me go to the CEO of Warner Media, a guy named Jason Kilar. So to follow the corporate structure of who owns what now, DC is owned by Warner. Warner is part of Warner Media. Warner Media has been acquired, I believe, a couple years ago. It finally became final in, I want to say, March, after a number of lawsuits and antitrust things were filed, and they prevailed. So the merger did go through, but they are now part of AT&T. So if you follow this now, AT&T now owns Superman, Batman, HBO. Yeah, probably there's a good chance they're running, that the cable that or the fiber optic connection that you're listening to this on and so forth. We're talking a massive, massive concern. And just to give you an idea of what the numbers are involved with, AT&T's revenue is so high that DC's entire comic line forms. I had the figure here a second ago. Yes, DC Comics is 0.2% of AT&T's annual revenue. So in terms of corporate priorities, it's a fair question to wonder how important DC Comics is to AT&T. So one thing that is common, and they let go about a third of the editorial staff at DC, all things considered. One thing that's common amongst all of them is it seems like they're doing a complete retrenchment of their digital initiatives. And in the words of Warner Media CEO Jason Kilar, it was to, quote, streamline decision making. But he laid out there's 3 points that he's trying to focus on. One, and the funny thing is I read these over, and the first 2 points basically sound like the same point. So it's a corporate 3. It's like a real world 3, but with one less. They want to concentrate on going consumer versus wholesale. They want to go direct to the consumer, which again, I would say sounds a lot like the first point. And they want to go global. All right, who doesn't? But if you're looking at what they're getting rid of, and especially when you think about the way that this pairs with, it was actually covered in our second podcast, so 9 weeks ago, the retreat from, I don't know if you want to call it retreat, but basically the termination of the distribution agreement with Diamond Publishing, Diamond Comic Distribution, in favor of a couple of small guys that, very much are, at the beck and call of DC directly. What DC seems to be doing is really pulling away from the traditional comic store. As a matter of fact, so we look about getting rid of the comic book specialty and newsstand sales guy Jim Sokolowski. And this was like a name on the list that just, it stood out for me. It didn't seem to stand out for almost anyone else, but he was the guy responsible for making sure that your local comic store got adequately, supported in terms of, sales, promotion, and all the things you need to do to be successful selling comics directly at your comic store. It seems more and more, when you put that together with Jason Kilar, the CEO of Warner Media's statements, like the comic store, your local comic store, is not really a focus for Warner Media anymore. What they seem to want to do is not go through the intermediary there, but they want to sell directly to you. Originally, they were doing this on the comic front through a venture called DC Universe, which was kind of a mashup of it was a subscription service. I believe it went for $7.49 or $7.99 a month. But what it would do is it would take all their various film and television properties, a couple of their movies, and a lot of their comics, about 22,000 of their DC comics, and they put them together in a rather attractive app. And you could have sort of an all-you-can-eat service of these things. The problem with DC Universe is it started out very strong, as most initiatives from Warner Media always do, but it had a hard time breaking news all the time. It was a good time originally when they were rolling out their TV lines to say, and here's the new Birds of Prey, and here's the new Suicide Squad, and here's all the new DC stuff we have coming from DC Direct in terms of action figures and whatever else, as well as giving spotlights to creators and new titles and so forth. But that really seems like it's pulled, the rap I'm hearing on it is it really pulled back over the years, and it really kind of became just another mishmash, subscription service with similar priced points to, but not the same range as, some other things like, say, Disney Direct. So it became a little bit of a ghetto. Now, complicating this as well, and remember, we're talking massive media companies here. You guys might have heard of a TV channel called the CW. So what's the CW? The CW is, amalgamation of CBS and Warner Brothers, thus the C and thus the W. So what they would do is they put together their content as an ad-supported platform, and you wind up seeing just a ton of DC TV, material put out on this platform. So you'd see, Supergirl, Smallville, Birds of Prey, and so forth. Would all, The Flash, and so forth, would all run on the CW. And to the extent that those things were locked up, in those sort of exclusives, they couldn't run on exclusively on DC Universe. Similarly, because corporations sometimes will let different divisions, they grow up with different objectives, and they don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily make sense when you look at the company as a whole. It's not infrequent to see whole problems where you look at something like HBO Max, which is originally owned by AT&T, became in direct competition with their own subsidiary, DC Universe, and because AT&T was the guys who bought Warner Brothers, you don't have to really guess as to which initiative is going to have the most juice behind it from a corporate level. So HBO Max has had things like the new Watchmen TV series and so forth, and it sounds like all those TV initiatives are getting rolled into the HBO Max platform. DC Universe sounds like it's basically having the life sucked out of it. So it's a fair question to ask what remains. Clearly they want to really redo what they're doing in terms of serving up content to consumers directly. Maybe they'll re-envision DC Universe. They do have a new platform. Yeah, I don't know. See, it's more of an event. I mean, they're calling it a platform, but there's a streaming event coming up on, I believe, the 24th, so that makes it 12 days from now, called the DC Fandom. So if you go to fandom.com, or I think dcfandom.com, you'll see what that is. And honestly, it sounds like their own little mini Comic-Con just for DC stuff. It's possible they will cast further note on how some of the stuff is going to land. It's possible they're twisting in the wind. We don't really know. Like I say, I think for us fans, I would say it probably means that you're going to be concentrating the titles quite a bit. DC has already dropped a ton of, a lot of titles are missing in action, from moving on to the new stuff. You will probably see a lot of Bat titles. You'll continue to see a lot of Superman and Justice League titles. But beyond those kind of core DC hero things, it's a good question what's going to go, what's going to come up. The people who are replacing the old guys on the editorial, so the people who are about to move into the role of editor-in-chief or publisher, the good news for us is a couple of familiar names on that one. Marie Javins, I want to make sure I get these right. Yeah, here we are. Marie Javins, old-time comic, she is an OG legit comic creator. Been working in the industry forever, I believe as a colorist for a lot of it. But she's been all over the place. Real experienced old hand, good to see. And Michelle Wells, who frankly appears like largely a corporate type. She was in DC's children's publishing division. They're being promoted to run publishing, and they'll be reporting to Jim Lee for a little while, and then Jim Lee's going to move on to something else. So expect Marie Javins and Michelle Wells to become effectively the new co-publishers of DC, for whatever that means. I would expect, I'm just guessing, I don't have an inside, I don't have an inside, source, on DC to let me know what's happening, but I would suspect that it means that they're going to get pretty focused on a couple of core lines. You think about like what Teen Titans Go means in terms of younger readers. When you think about what Superman and Batman mean in terms of like their core material, I think you'll continue to see stuff like that. Will you see a bunch of spin-off stuff like Doom Patrol series or The Losers or things that have to do with like more of the peripheral characters of the DC universe? I doubt it. I think that's going to be a hard sell at DC for a while. Plus, you just killed half a third of the editors, so there's going to be less people around just to even make sure those books get out the door. So I'd say expect a lot of Bat titles and a lot of Superman titles, Wonder Woman titles, things like that. Beyond that, I think less experimentation overall is probably going to be the initial take of what we see. But time will tell. I'd be interested in see what you guys think, and this would be a good time to pull down to the comments. Let's see. Pam Lifford wasn't happy regarding Batman Damn, so it wasn't surprising Black Label's going to get changed. Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. Okay, and Jean P says the sound is better. So, awesome. So that's what's going on with that. All right. Other questions about stuff that's going on. One thing I want to comment about is there was some interesting data I turned up when I was looking at the question of like, well, where do comics even fall in people's priority lists these days? So I mean, at this point, 80%, well, 75% of the comic industry is controlled by two companies. And no, neither of those companies has the word comic in their name. The first one is Disney Publishing, or Disney. Disney owns not only theme parks and lots of other things. They own Marvel Comics now because they bought Marvel Comics and Star Wars and a lot of other things a long time ago. Marvel is currently running at, let me look at the numbers, Marvel is currently running at 44.72% market share. So they're doing pretty good. And DC slipped quite a bit, down to about 30% market share in the latest reported year. The other big players, in case you guys were wondering, are Image, IDW, Dark Horse, and I know I'm missing one more, Boom, which is a surprise to me. But what you're seeing between Boom and IDW is a lot of general purpose friendly titles, a lot of broad market appeal. Image has still kept. Image is actually the most interesting comic publisher playing right now. Which, man, 1992 Pete would never have said that. But in terms of the variety of content that's coming out of Image, you were getting everything from mature space fantasy to kids titles to horror, you name it. You never know what's going to happen with Image. Image is effectively a creator-owned studio. The way the Image works, by the way, is that anyone can approach Image with a proposal and say, hey guys, I've got a book. I've got me and my artist buddy. We've got a book together. Here's the first issue of it. It's about blah. And Image says, okay, if we think you can sell X amount of copies of that one, we'll just act as your publishing house. We take a percentage, and other than that, the book is yours. They don't tell you what to do. They don't edit you, and so forth. So Image is really that and say Dark Horse are probably the creator friendliest places to go in terms of having your ability to. It's almost like indie publishing, except it's very successful indie publishing. Which, again, if you look at the initial offerings out of Image with like Wildcats, and which by the way is Jim Lee's before he got lured away to DC. Wildcats, Spawn, Savage Dragon, Youngblood, and so forth. You saw a bunch of big, stylized, heavily muscled superheroes. You didn't see a ton of variety in the initial, things that came out, the initial properties that came out of Image. And I was thinking, other than having superior art and coloring, I don't know what these guys are bringing to the comic world. And Image has really been a stalwart as far as bringing interesting stuff out. You might remember them also brought a little thing out called The Walking Dead. So anyway, Image is got the biggest, non-Marvel, non-DC part of the pie. Then again, followed by IDW and Boom and Dark Horse. But between those guys, that's most of the comic market. What's the importance of comics to a company like Disney? We already talked about how DC Comics Publishing is, with their 30% market share, they're worth 0.2% of AT&T's overall revenue picture. Marvel is similar. Marvel has a 44.2% share of the comic market, but they still are a tiny, tiny fraction of Disney's overall revenue. What matters more than comics to these folks? Well, to start with TV, DC makes about $1 billion a year off of their various TV properties. So Supergirl, Batwoman, whatever else, all those things, they keep cranking them out. It tends to be very young adult friendly. It's like they call it YA fiction, young adult fiction. It's the same sort of audience that would watch, say, Supernatural, or what's the Archie one? No, it's not Smallville. Riverdale. Thank you. But they've been fairly successful packaging that up and using that as just a traditional TV kind of commercial mid-budget TV. It's not too horrifically expensive to make these shows. There isn't a ton of CGI. There's a little bit, but it's kind of knock it out stuff. These are not really expensive shows to make. The movie situation is potentially bigger for both of them, but it's also a lot more complicated. Let me see if I can get you some Let me see if I can get a couple of graphics up on stream here, which I think I can do here. If I switch to, sorry, go into Stream Deck, and let's go pull up a couple things. All right. So, first of all, let's talk about superhero movies as a whole. All right. So, superhero movies, you might notice, have really, really taken off. And I'm going to show the graphic a little bigger so I can see what I'm doing. This is a little bit of a problem for me because I'm looking at a very small version of the same screen. That didn't work at all. All right, let's go back to the still. All right, so back to multi-view. Here we go. Look, this is not a show without at least one technical glitch. All right, so I'm going to see if I can follow along with this whole graphic here. And, oh, I know how to do this. I can watch it in my own image store. Ha, 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 ha. So, to give you guys a little bit of the behind the scenes on this one, I'm using a switcher, which has the ability to preload graphics in so I can, queue them up, as opposed to doing what I'm doing right now and babbling on along as I, try to load up files. Problem with the switcher, of course, is that, they're loaded up on the whole thing. They're ready to go with the push of a button, but then I don't see them on screen except when I'm looking through my own viewfinder at what the show is doing on the whole thing. So it's very, very hard for me to see small data. So pardon me for a moment while I load up the larger version of this whole thing so that my ancient eyes can see what you guys are seeing, in a little bit more reasonable form. All right. So, comic books. If you guys are old enough to remember the original comic book movies, so I gather in the mid-'60s was the first big comic book movie was Batman, the movie. This is with the Adam West Batman. If you guys have seen it, it was terrible. It was campy. It was awful. It was everything everyone loves and hates about that series to start with. But man, it was not the sort of interactive fiction brought to life and as big as your imagination that any of us would have hoped for. Anyway, so the comic book movies weren't a big deal. Batman didn't make a lot of money. Matter of fact, none of the movies made a lot of money until probably Superman came along in the 70s. Superman 2, you're still ticking along at a few million, small $100 million is kind of where we're talking about the whole thing. Batman from Tim Burton came out. That made a bit of a splash. That was, the start of a good property. Batman Returns, I believe, was the sequel with the Catwoman and so forth. That was a pretty solid showing as well. And then Joel Schumacher got a hold of the whole thing and drove that property into the freaking ground. Later on, Marvel, in the meantime, during the 70s, was making just terrible, things. Some of those ones, you can actually find them on old comic-based discs, because we were able to get the movie previews put on from some of the things like Captain America the movie, or Doctor Strange, or I believe there's even, I don't think this one made its way onto the discs because it was a bootleg. We can only run things we have the rights to show, but there was a bootleg version of Fantastic Four where it was the world's worst foam rubber suit for the thing you've ever seen. Anyway, needless to say, none of these guys made any money. But then somewhere in the late 90s, Marvel got their mojo going. And they did the X-Men, they did a number of very successful follow-ups to the whole thing, and then the whole thing just really took off. And you could really see Comic-Con switching right about that time, where it went from like one of those things like, oh, wouldn't it be great if someone made a movie of a comic book, to, oh my god, everyone here is a Hollywood producer looking for small properties that aren't very expensive to option, which might blow up and become very big. This is how Walking Dead got picked up. Now, obviously, as we look at the current years of the whole thing has gotten absolutely nuts. It's Avengers came along and was massive. There are a number of other titles that the Christopher Nolan Batman ones did very, very solid, and the whole thing just really took off to the point where when you're staring down $3 billion a year in revenue, which is where we're at right now. Suddenly, you've got 300 million in revenue on the entire comic book end of your business, and you've got $3 billion that's floating around for the making of comic book movies. It's really easy to see where people would put their attention. Another thing that comes up to mind is let's talk a little bit about how the different companies have done in terms of monetizing their stuff. Let's have a look. First of all, let's look at Marvel versus DC. So let's look at Marvel first. I think we can get this guy to come up. That would be graphic number 7. There we go. Hope you guys can see this stuff okay. I'm unfortunately having to magnify this out so that I can see it. All right, so this is Marvel and that's Marvel and DC as investments. Let's look at just the Marvel movies. That's the graphic I want to show. This is a pretty impressive list. For Marvel, because again, I'm thinking of Marvel as the company that came out with that god-awful Fantastic Four movie not so long ago, and they've really turned the situation around. Obviously, Avengers Endgame was bigger than big, almost $3 billion in worldwide box office for that one movie alone. Infinity War, $2 billion, billion with a B. The Avengers, the original one, $1.5 billion. By the way, these are not inflation adjusted figures. So the nearly $3 billion for Avengers Endgame, while impressive, is not necessarily night and day better than the $1.5 billion from Avengers, was it 7 years earlier. It's like, it's still more, but it's not as much more as it looks. Black Panther did amazingly well, Iron Man 3, etc. You have to get into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, the 10th place before you even drop below $1 billion for Marvel's comic book efforts over the last 8 years. Anyway, so yeah, they've done very, very well for themselves. Against that, though, let's have a look at how DC did. And that, I believe, is graphic number 6. Let's hit that one. All right. This is a little less impressive. All right. So, the one I actually missed, I think I saw this movie. It made no impression on me whatsoever. Was Aquaman. Shot for $160,000. It made almost 10 times that at the box office, or I guess 8 times. $1.4 billion. That's pretty darn good. Batman vs Superman. Critics hated it, but it did okay. 872 million is not anything to laugh about. Wonder Woman, much praised, quite a bit cheaper to make. A very, very solid movie. 821,000. Suicide Squad, it was a little lukewarm at first. The domestic box wasn't all that, but it did great internationally, so it made up for a lot of the ground. All the way down to some of the less impressive ones. Shazam, Birds of Prey, and it had an amazingly long title, which I've now forgotten. That one was absolutely stillborn. That one released in February of this year. They shut down all the movies not much later, and honestly, it didn't have a great opening weekend to start with. So that's kind of like the end of DC's run. But DC's entire best movie run is like 8 movies over the last 10 years or so. Or 7 years. I guess you have to go back to the Christopher Nolan Batmans to start seeing the big hits after that. So DC and Marvel have been looking at each other, and again, if you've got one division that's pulling in, 10 times the revenue that the other division is. So if your animated properties and your movies are pulling 10 times the revenue of the comics, one of the things that the CEOs have got to be doing and looking at is saying like, hey, where's if you're at Warner Media and you're looking over at Marvel apparently makes something like 43% more on their movies than DC does. If you look at the overall revenue, versus their if you look at their overall ROI on their movies, Marvel movies are much more profitable to make, or at least they've been on a really good roll. You got to be looking at that if you're over at Warner Media and saying, what do they got that we don't got? Our characters are great, but why can't we turn this into money? And so they're seeing a lot of shaking up in the way that their TV properties are being housed. You're seeing a lot of shaking up in the way that their movie properties are being greenlit and so forth. And frankly, I think they want to do more to sell that straight to the consumer. So it's going to be interesting, but you do wonder, are the comics just a way for them floating story ideas, or is that just is it a loss leader for them essentially on developing their creative properties? Hard to know. The Joker was DC's biggest breakout hit of the last couple of years, made for next to nothing. I want to say it was like a $65 million picture. Almost no CGI. You had to hire one very good actor to anchor the whole darn thing. And it made, I believe at this point it's now north of $1 billion at the box office. That thing was an absolute freaking home run. It looks like what DC is looking at in terms of their movie projects going forward right now is a lot of these auteur, more mid-level spend kind of things, not heavy on the CGI, not heavy on the production budget, but just trying to get a whole lot of these kind of like, home runs as opposed to just going for the Avengers-style grand slams. At least, from what the properties I've seen greenlit, that's, where the slate looks like to me. Let me stop here with this, massive movie analysis here, and let's check some of the comments, see where we're doing on stuff, because I don't want to get too far into the whole thing. Okay, Greg points out percentage in reference to the Diamond direct sales market. It doesn't include young reader YA and so forth. It's part of the comic market is huge. You are undoubtedly right. Let me show Greg's comment on screen here. Yeah, it's super hard to get industry stats that cut across all the different markets. So when you're looking at how are YA titles, young readers sold in the direct comics market outside of comic stores, it's a hard figure to find. I would, if you've got access to the current stats on that one, I'd love if you could, shoot me some references. I was going from DC tends to be the best purveyor I've found of good market stats that cut across, the width of the comic market. But when you get into some of the other specialty retailing stuff like that, I'm not sure if it gets rolled up in any kind of public way. But I would be very interested in seeing that. All right, John P says, what size is info on? Got this from a number of different places. Box Office Mojo is a good source for a lot of this stuff. There's a site called thenumbers.com, which specializes in film box office numbers. And then some of the really fun ones, like the graph of comic movies over time, came from a place called Statista, which I'm used to actually buying data from them when I was involved with back when I was doing a lot of consulting in the mobile space. I would a lot of times buy statistic reports from them, Forrester, Gardner, and some of the other folks, just to talk about how, what percentage of people in a certain demographic have mobile phones, what type of phone do they have, what capabilities on their phone, so forth. This is just a great big clearinghouse of just interesting data. A lot of the data they put out there for free, some of the more interesting stuff, especially if you're in the kind of businesses that really want to know, how many female people of Asian descent are using TikTok, on a daily basis. That kind of information, that will typically cost you to know that. But it's something that if you are interested in delving into that sort of stuff, you can get to it. I believe they've got a relatively cheap monthly plan that gives you the basic stuff. Greg says they make the movies too dark. They learn to lighten up with Aquaman. I'm not sure if I 100% agree. I mean, I think the Batman Superman ones didn't really play to what people loved in the Batman character so much. I'm sorry, not the Batman, but I don't think they played to what people loved in the Superman character so much. I thought Justice League was a bit of a muddle. The Aquaman lightened up quite a bit. I thought that went over well, but the other big hits that DC's had recently are, say, Joker and the Christopher Nolan Batmans, and those are dark as anything. So, I don't know. I think you really just got to be a point where you're really pitching your movie to what the fans want from that movie. If I were to make like a madcap, funny Batman movie today, I think it would go over, like, as they say, like a Led Zeppelin. I guess that's my take on it. All right. Richard Scott says, doesn't surprise me, at least it's all about the properties. It's... So Marvel, I used to get Marvel's stock report. So back when Marvel went public, back in the 90s, they did a couple things that were kind of cool. First of all, they were riding high. This was the '90s glut when you could, everyone I knew was buying 5 copies of every comic book that was coming out. The comics only cost $1. It was not much of a risk, and it seemed like everything was taken off and converting into gold. Until they killed Superman and the whole thing seemed like it blew up. But anyway, back in the 90s, Marvel went public and it had a very good IPO, and one of the things they did that was kind of neat is they actually published their annual report in the form of a comic book, which I thought was cool, and so I wanted to buy a few shares on Marvel. First of all, it seemed like a decent investment, but yeah, I took a small position in Marvel because hey, I wanted to get a copy of the annual report because that's just kind of neat. I do believe the annual report's in Comic Base, by the way. If it's not, we need to add it. But anyway, one of the things that Marvel would advertise when they're essentially, throwing their pitch out to shareholders and investors is they would say something like, "We have 11,000." Licensed characters. This is also the years when you'd see the little TM and the even like the R, the registered trademark symbol. Whenever it says like, beware of the wrath of, Wolverine. TM. You'd actually see that on the first, appearance of the whole thing on the title. That was obnoxious, but they were very much touting that the entire value of our company is that we have these characters. And once you have the character, and it could be something really, really stupid, like Speedball, the most unfortunately, Speedball or the Whizzer? I think you have to share titles as far as the most unfortunately named Marvel characters. Speedball, if anyone who's ever lived through the '70s knows, is a drug term. The Whizzer, if you've ever been a boy, you know what that is. But anyway, it'd be like the Whizzer, TM. Anyway, once you've got the character, you can do what you want with it. You can make a comic book out of it. You could make a plush toy. You could make a movie out of it. Whatever else, but the person who controls the character is going to make at least half the money that comes out of the use of that character. So yeah, having just a ton of characters was worth something. I believe also that the incentive structure, if you're writing for Marvel, is that depending on your contract with Marvel, you sometimes, like Frank Miller, could get a percentage of the character's royalties. So if you created someone like Elektra and you really blew them up big, that was worth money to you for having created a cool character. Marvel got most of the money, but you got a big hunk. A lot of the reason that the Image came about was it was the early '90s. Everything was turning into gold in the comics industry, and a lot of the people who were the really hottest artists, Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane, and so forth, had really made characters that were just kind of so-so, had made them into huge phenomenons, but they weren't getting percentages off them. So I mean, Eric Larson didn't get part of the Hulk. Jim Lee didn't get part of the X-Men. Todd McFarlane didn't get part of Spider-Man. He might have taken this thing and turned it into a million seller, but he didn't get all he got was his artist share and whatever bonus structure he was on. He didn't get part of the overall royalty. Whereas if you create Spawn, that's your baby. All right. Gary says, I remember Bobby Chase. My family visited Hawaii. We ate at the same restaurant as Aquaman. Pretty cool. That's all right, man. All right. Let's see here. All right. So, Confident Message. Do you think the same kind of reduction could happen at Marvel or IDW? Interesting question. I haven't heard any rumors of immediate problems over at Disney/Marvel. They are getting pretty far out on a limb, as far as I can see, on some of their messaging. You do wonder, like, the things that are earning them press right now are things like the new version of, I believe it's the New Warriors, where they're have the totally woke superhero team with such compelling characters as Snowflake and Safe Space, and I don't know if that's a marketing win. It's a press win. Free press is still press. They call it earned media, right? But is it going to turn into? Is it going to be something that either sells a lot of comics for those things, or sells a lot of brand loyalty, or any of the things that companies value? I don't know. One of the things that's really weird about companies just in general, and a lot of people puzzle this out about Hollywood, is they wonder, for instance. if you want to make a lot of money in Hollywood, what rating? I would ask this one as a question to my daughter. It's like, if you want to make a ton of money in Hollywood, what rating should your movie have? Should it be, an X or NC-17? Clearly not. Should be an R. Most Hollywood movies are R's, right? So, is that the one that, is the most lucrative rating to have for your movie? Because, I mean, you certainly could take something that's an R movie and, take out, sex and violence in order until you reach to PG-13. But how come you make the R, right? And there's a theory that says, well, yeah, I want to make it so that it feels like an adult title, so that I'll want to go to it. And it's just not just a kiddie movie. Well, the fact of the whole thing is the really, really big movies in Hollywood are basically G and PG. It's R-rated movies, just by rating, make tiny fractions of the return on investment that that they do. So then why do Hollywood people make R-rated movies at all, right? If you could make a movie that anyone could see, that you could sell just a ton of tickets to, why do you do it, right? I mean, and why do you throw in the extra sex and violence? And I think the answer has a lot to do with, well, it makes me as a filmmaker feel like I'm doing something cool that I would want to see and that my buddies would think I'm cool doing. It's not about the money. I think it's about being, you want to be successful. You want to make enough money that you're allowed to keep making movies. But I think it's more about being cool. I mean, you want to be the kind of guy that gets invited to the cool parties that everyone thinks of, oh, well, you're a serious filmmaker. You're not just making those stupid, goofy kids movies, right? R-rated movies can actually earn Oscars. You'll earn, critical acclaim. They'll get you invited to to hang out at the beach with, like, fashionable people. You make $1 jillion, voicing Dory in, a Pixar film, it isn't going to make you, it's going to make you a ton of money, but it's not going to make you cool. So, anyway, yeah, I'm getting a little distracted on this one, but I think Marvel maybe is, as they say, out over their skis a little bit with doing things that they think make them look cool and all hip and forward, progressive thinking and whatever else. Maybe not so much in terms of making money, but honestly, that's for the market to say. I don't really know. You get indulged on that until you don't get indulged on that. Dan Didio, God, is it Didio or Didio? Does anyone here know where the accent falls? So you can clue me in, because I feel like an idiot if I'm saying that wrong. He got notoriously kicked out of DC a couple of years ago. The thought at the time had been that he'd wandered a little bit too far along the woke path. The official quote was that he had created a unpleasant work environment. He apparently can get to be a little bit of a micromanager. Knew him just a little bit. He seemed like a real passionate guy. He seemed like a guy who really cared about comic books, but he also cared about his own causes. When you look at, if you guys ever seen a podcast called Rageaholic, or was it Razor Fist? Interesting dude, and I'm gonna just give a shout out to him. Razor Fist basically comes off as like a Mr. Heavy Metal head. And he basically does interesting, very entertaining rants on things, as well as a lot of reviews of heavy metal albums. So if you're interested, he's an interesting dude to hang out with. He had a pretty good rant on the DC thing earlier on, where he was more or less saying, yeah, the whole downfall of Dan Didio was due to going, all progressive and whatever else. Like, I can't put any I don't have the inside source that would tell me whether that's true or not. You can get to the point where you're just annoying to work with, because you're either, you don't play with the team, or you do, or you're so far out on your own trip, and other times not. I think people indulge you till they don't, when you want to go off on a tangent. So yeah, that's my read on it. If anyone has really close friends and the whole thing who actually know any of this stuff, I'm curious to hear some scuttlebutt on the whole thing, because I don't want to spread rumors about anyone that I don't personally know that this is how it went down or not. But that's what's going on with that. Okay, so let's see here. Publishers Weekly just did an article on the 2019 comics market. Thank you, Greg. I will look at that. So going back to comic stats, Greg also points out, I think DC learned the wrong lessons from the Nolan Bat films, made everything so dark. It's quite possible. It also has a lot to do with your choice of director. So, for instance, I believe it was Zack Snyder who did Watchmen and the Batman Superman. On one of those ones, I think he was a great choice. I think he was actually not a bad pick for Watchmen. On the other hand, yeah, again, I think when you go dark Superman, it just feels like a betrayal of the character to me. But it's that's I could be wrong. At the end of the day, people vote with their money. All right. PEW's thing is highlighted on Heidi McDonald's The Beat. I had forgotten all about Heidi McDonald. Heidi McDonald, again, is one of these great comic industry folks, and I need to read her stuff more often. She is one of the legit sources. By the way, I think there's better journalism happening on the comics market than I see for the modern political scene. There's more things I could read and say, oh, that's an interesting insight that actually appears to be backed by data and facts. It's like, I've read more of that reading up on this stuff than I've read in a month of political coverage of anything. So that's, anyway, props to the journalists who are actually still out there working, and Heidi McDonald is one of them. I need to go back and read more of her stuff. Says chat doesn't allow links to the PW or Beat article. Sorry, Gray, if you don't mind, shoot me an email or something with that. You got my email. Ray also points that the Wonder Woman was not bad at all. Oh, and yes, the Steve Ditko created a Speedball. Yeah, but that doesn't make it right. So there was a. I'm trying to remember the name of the event. It was in the 90s at some point. Was it Bloodline? No, Bloodlines was the DC one. Bloodlines was the event where it was really just roulette. It was like, all right, so let me tell you the deal with annuals, if you guys don't know it. So comic annuals come out of really just the gap in the publishing schedule that comes with having, if you publish every 4 weeks, right, that gives you 4 times, 4 times 12 that's 48. You got an extra, if that's your schedule for how often you come out with things, it leaves you a couple times, with a couple extra things you could be doing all year to fill in the 52 weeks where you really want to have new product coming into the store every week. And one of the things that people came up with was the idea of an annual. So it's like, okay, it's the 13th issue. Well, how do we get the guys to do that? Well, one thing you do is you take a lot of inventory stories that like people have maybe proposed for inclusion in your thing, but you never ran. Like if you're a young aspiring guy and you want to get on staff at DC, it used to be what you'd do is you'd write a 4 to 8 page story and you'd pitch it and say, well, this is my idea for Wonder Woman. This is my idea for Batman. And you're not going to kick off the main guy on Batman. It's certainly not at the start. But you might get into an annual, or you might get into a special edition or something like that. And if people respond to it, hey, maybe you get another character, maybe you get moved up to a second position at some point, and eventually, you might actually someday work your way to the point where you actually do become the new Batman guy. But that's how that stuff goes. Well, one of the things that you do with annuals, because again, you're just trying to keep new product in the stores every 4 weeks, every week, and again on the 4-week schedule, you've got some gaps. So one of the things you try to do on that one is you kind of come up with an event. And Marvel had one this year. DC had one called, I think it's called Bloodlines. I want to say this was 1992. And what they were doing is basically saying, hey guys, create your own character. It doesn't need to make any sense, but in your annual, the only thing we want to see is that you make at least one new character. And they had terrible characters come out of it. Although I do believe one of the characters that came out was Azrael. Tell me if I'm wrong on this one. My memory does get a little foggy on this one. Azrael, famously, big Batman villain, got his own title, became like kind of a big deal. The Demon originally, I believe, I want to say came out of Bloodlines. There were a couple others. Marvel had something similar go out. I forget the name of their event. If someone could put it in the chat, I will be very impressed. But their whole deal is they were going to have a new character in all of their annuals for that year. And they invited anyone to come up with them. And Steve Ditko, the guy who invented Spider-Man, right, came out and said, I got a guy called Speedball. He's bouncy, and he runs really fast, and he bounces off stuff. That's his whole deal. It wasn't good. I'm just, I want to say he even got his own series, years later, just based on the kind of weird nostalgia you get for characters that are so awful that you can't really let him go. At which point I'm also waiting for Battling Bantam to get his own title at some point. Yeah, that was a thing. Didio, thank you so much, Gregory Heck. Dan Didio. Okay, cool. Don't get into the Scorsese debate. Fair enough. All right. Greg C says they act as if Superman only has two villains, Brainiac and Zod. What about Brainiac? So hard to do a movie with him. What about Mongol? That's a really good question. You know, how you know, Brainiac is. Well, I'm gonna say it. He's a more cerebral villain, right? So you've got to do something that's actually kind of clever. But does that mean that you're going to have, how does that play to the strengths of? On one hand, when you see Superman, you want to see him, taking on incredible challenges, fighting almost cosmic levels of force. And on the other hand, your villain is a guy who's just really smart, kind of like Lex Luthor. I think, I always feel like people have a better feel for how to handle Lex Luthor, because these days they're making him like a captain of industry and just kind of like a cerebral bad guy who still can move armies of men and material and things around in order to achieve his goals. Brainiac, they still try doing that, but the problem is because of his character composition, it always comes off as a little bit sci-fi, and I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm not sure if it resounds as much for me, but your mileage may vary. Here's an idea: let your animation staff write the live movie because they get it. Oh hell yeah, absolutely. For that matter, another great. I'm just giving out podcast recommendations at this point. If you guys like fan stuff, check out another podcast called by a guy called he bills himself as Critical Drinker. Basically, both he and Razor Fist they're regular dudes, but they're playing a character. But he plays himself essentially as a drunk Scotsman reviewing fan films and stuff like that. But he's got really decent insights on why movies work or don't work, and his take on where the Star Wars movies went wrong when they jettisoned the expanded universe, I thought was just bang on. The idea that you would turn that over to Kathleen Kennedy, who was Steven Spielberg's assistant, and who didn't actually seem to like the universe much, as opposed to drawing on everything that everyone, all the creators in the comic world, like John Jackson Miller had done with Knights of the Old Republic, and just the whole expanded universe. You had such a vast wealth of story and character to draw on, and you just kind of went, nah, let's just put in a bunch of politics instead, and that didn't work great. Greg says, not Azrael. I don't think Hitman came from Bloodlines. You are absolutely correct. Demon was created in the 70s by Kirby. That is true. But wasn't he featured in a Bloodlines? I want to say like he got like a new lease on life or something. I'm sorry. I'm fundamentally a Marvel guy. I'm going to cop to that one. My DC stuff largely formed by my relationship with them when they went over and essentially did the British invasion stuff, where they took on Garth Ennis and Alan Moore and those guys. That's where I really came over to DC in a big way. So things that aren't like your real classic comics that also weren't part of the British stuff tend to be a gap in my comic knowledge. So I apologize for anything I'm getting wrong here. And Greg also points out, yes, Kirby created the Demon in the 70s. And Greg says, I meant Grant. Got it. Okay, so let's see. These do Brainiac in the Krypton series, and Richard says 1972. All right, so thank you. You guys are a wealth of comic knowledge. I'm glad when you guys can fill in for all the things I'm getting wrong. Anyway, so I feel like I've been beaten up on DC tonight. I want to close this with something that's actually like positive, because DC, again, I'm cheering for everyone on this one. This is one of those things where you think about where fandom is, and I'm trying to get I get a little philosophical about, well, what do we want out of our hobbies? And part of it is we want, that moment of magic where we're in this, we're reading it, from whatever our perfect age was, and we remember reading whatever our favorite comic was the first time, or that really great story. And like for me on the X-Men, the first time I ever read Days of Future Past, or for that matter, any of the X-Men from 131 to 143 or so, I was like, oh, it doesn't get better than this. I mean, I couldn't believe how great that was. And so we kind of fall in love with that time, and it lives in our head in a way that it will never appear anywhere else outside of our head. But when you even see flashes of it in like the movies, you're like, yes, absolutely. I'm stoked to see that. And you get very protective of that. I feel like we do need to let that's our goal. As Maggie Thompson put it, everyone's got their own golden age, right? They call the comic golden age is supposed to be the 1940s, and so, well, it's not my golden age. I wasn't born, right? My golden age is probably 1981 or so, or 1980, or 1990, or just all the time when, like, again, you fall in love with the things that you love to this day. That's your golden age. So I think we all, always want to recapture that moment, and it's hard to let that go. At the same time, you got to also let new folks into the market and let them discover their own golden age. So you got to let the characters change, or at least introduce new characters that say something to the new people walking into the market. I hate it when they take a character I knew and loved and make him into something that, as far as I'm concerned, he isn't. I'd much rather you introduced a new character that might speak to something that the new guys want. But leave my characters alone. Let me still have the continuity that comes with those characters. I mean, I can only handle about 20 retcons before my brain just explodes. And honestly, Peter Parker is Spider-Man. I don't care what anyone else says. And the same thing goes with Steve Rogers and Captain America. It's like, the character you invested so much of yourself into, don't make the guy into a neo-Nazi or something stupid like that. It just feels like a betrayal of what you want. Anyway, what I was trying to get to, and I did have a point, it is, well, I'm not gonna dive into that too. I will explore that more fully in a future day. But I did want to say something that the DC is doing that I'm just kind of in love with. You guys, I want to hip you to a site called Zavvi, and let me double check it because I always get the spelling wrong. There's two potential ways I could think to spell Zavvi, and one of them takes you completely to the wrong place, and one of them is great. All right, so the right way to spell Zavvi is Z-A-V-V-I, or if you're British, because the site is British, Z-A-V-V-I. This is a site. It's basically a fan site. They do movies and T-shirts and action figures and toys and just neat stuff. And it tends to be a lot of just pop culture properties. And there's a lot of comic stuff that comes into it. And one of the things they do is amazing. Is they have graphic novel blowouts like I can't believe. Like last Christmas, they were selling I think 10 packs of DC graphic novels, just random, dealer's choice and the whole thing. I want to say they were something like £8.99 each, and shipping was like £2 or £3, right? Which, if you are following the distressed state of the the British pound versus the U.S. dollar right now, the British pound's trading for about $1.20. $1.25 buys you a pound. In my lifetime, I remember when a pound would go for $2. So for 25% more than you pay in dollars, you're getting just crazy amounts of stuff. And I was getting like full on like $20 DC graphic novels for the equivalent of like $2, shipped from England. And is, because I get involved with shipping in various pursuits of mine. I'm sitting there, how the heck is that even possible? I can't myself ship a comic book to England for less than $13. How the heck did they ship a bundle of graphic novels to me for like $4? And basically what it comes down to is if you ship just crazy amounts of stuff, DHL will do it for you very, very cheaply. And if you don't ship crazy amounts of stuff, DHL will not return your phone calls. But we're talking thousands of packages per day. If you're not at like the 5,000 packages per day kind of level of shipping, they don't really want to know you that badly, is my impression. I certainly tried on at least 3 occasions, and basically I got thrown into, yeah, we'll call you back, never. As soon as they learned that I wasn't going to move the kind of digits of personal shipping, through their service that they want to. But apparently, if you can move that kind of thing, you can really move product. Anyway, why am I telling you about Zavvi? So, and again, I don't get a piece of this at all. I'm just a fan. So Zavvi right now is running a deal where they have 5 graphic novels for £14.99. So for £3 each, or think of it $4 each, or $3.99, you get hardcover graphic novels from DC. Check this out. So I'm hoping this isn't going to reflect terribly. Actually, this worked out really well. The lighting is much better than when I tried this earlier. So this is like a full-on, very beautifully done hardcover graphic novel. This one in particular, this is like, you know, this is the equivalent of the DC graphic novel Swamp Thing #1. It's, you know, reprints Swamp Thing 21 through 27, as well as the original story from House of Secrets. It is beautifully done. It is hardcover. It is beautifully printed. This thing cost me as much as a regular comic book. So anyway, and by the way, if you ever want to sell me a ton of anything, here is the trick. Basically put a number on it, or do something like this. If you guys can see the sides of this, if you guys are really good, you'll recognize each of these things as part of the Alex Ross DC, Justice League and Villains paintings. So if you get them all in the right order, right, and I don't have enough of them to make anything sensible out of this, but if you were to put them on your shelf in the right order, they would actually make the full painting. You need to have like 70 of them for that, and you can only get about 20 of them off Zavvi right now. But I literally, this is one of those things where, like, last week I had ordered the first 5 that I wanted of the whole thing. I spent all in, along with a whole bunch of movies. It was nothing to get the whole thing. And as soon as I realized they actually showed up and what they looked like, I was like, just give me all the rest of them. So when those show up, and I think actually one of the things you heard in the background here was the DHL showing up at my door today. I look forward to putting together as much of that as possible. But Zavvi, Zavvi.com, have a look at these guys. I think they're a pretty cool store. I also picked up a lot of really cool, obscure, like 4K and Blu-ray movies from these guys. Just a lot of neat stuff. They remind me a lot of things from Another World, if you guys remember that one, from the company that Dark Horse was involved with, where it's got some curation. It's not just a bunch of just Kmart foo that they could find. It seems like it has a point of view, but it's a neat site. So I want to give them a shout out. All right, so anything else we got going on? Greg says issue the new Star Wars films didn't have a plan. Yeah, possibly. Look, I thought number 7 was great, except I also thought that it was an almost point for point. What do you call it? It's not a moment. It's a it's like note for note, beat for beat. Remake of A New Hope. That said, look, I loved it, and then 8 just destroyed everything I loved about the entire thing. After Last Jedi, I didn't want to know from Star Wars after that. It would just, as my teenage daughter put it, it was like bad fan fiction, and I couldn't agree more. Okay, and Greg also wants to remind everyone, don't forget to thread the Cook-based message boards, your request topics. Awesome. Marvel Star Wars comics filling in the gaps is great, though. I would agree that. I also think Dark Horse's Star Wars comics are pretty darn decent. Gary also points out, Gregory also points out that there's some good stuff going on there. And John says that's the way we saw it say it in Canada. Was that Didio? All right. Yes. Oh, no, Zed. Yes. People give you a weird look when you say ZZ Top as a music group. Wow. Yeah. I would as well. All right. And Pandemica, 5-issue series. Actually, we just got. I just got issue 5 of that myself. I believe just today. So that looks pretty cool. So anyway, guys. Thank you so much. Next week's going to be a little bit more conventional, way less literary analysis and such like that. And I do hope to talk more about some cool things we've gotten. I'll be honest about it. I have had a salmon week as far as dealing with issues on Comic Base. There are some kind of like big infrastructural issues I've been trying to get on top of, and man, ain't nothing going easily right now. This is just one of those things where like you just... I've been building installers for like 30-40 hours in a row, just cranking one after another, just trying to bludgeon the problem into submission. Some weeks are like that when you're doing programming or developing anything, and sometimes you just got to pound through to get to the other side. So not a lot of success to report on that front right now, but I hope to shortly. Honestly, I feel like if I could just crack 1 or 2 more things, I could actually have some pretty neat things to talk about. But anyway, so we'll get to that next time. Guys, thanks for joining me, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.